Two and a Half Admins, episode 219. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Allan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, you've got to plug Allan. NAS, maintenance best practices.
Yeah, so if you maintain a NAS and need to keep it working and want it to last a long time, this article kind of walks through some of the things you should be watching for and monitoring and making sure to keep your NAS and your storage healthy.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. So today is Halloween, and I thought we'd have a bit of silly fun. I thought you two could tell me some of your spooky horror stories of terrible things that have happened to you in your careers.
A fun one that happened to me was, so many years ago. We were migrating from one data center to another. So the data center we was in was at a good local cable company, but they got bought by the big national cable company, and they're like, yeah, we want all the data center space to ourselves, get out. So we had a relatively short time to move all of our machines to a new data center. So we thought, all right, we'll do half the machines on the first day, and then the other half of the machines a couple days later. So we configured all the machines so that on next reboot, they would boot with the different subnet and the different default gateway and all the other configuration so that they're up and running at the old data center. And as we power them off, put them in the car, drive them an hour and something to the other data center, rack them up, turn them on, they'll come on with the right configuration.
I'm pretty sure I smell what's happening here.
Do you want to take a guess, Jim?
Well, did somebody reboot them all before they actually got moved to the second center?
Almost worse. The cable company who had taken over the old data center had kind of neglected the maintenance. And so there was a power failure and the generator kicked on, but the cable that ran power from the generator to the transfer switch had corroded and didn't transfer any electricity. So once the UPSs ran dead, the entire data center went dark. So when we came in to remove our equipment as scheduled, the building was full of other people trying to get their machines back online. So it was much more complicated trying to unrack machines and carry them out the door because there were all these other people in the way when normally this would have been relatively empty. But yes, all of our machines rebooted on the new configuration. And we managed to get the other ones back, but we were using YP, the Yellow Pages NIS mechanism, kind of a precursor to LDAP, to manage usernames and passwords. And so when the network wasn't working, you try to log in and if you ran top or LS, trying to map a user ID to a username would try for over 60 seconds before timing out. So every command you're trying to do, if you don't remember to put the -n flag, it just has this 60-second latency while it tries to look up a username.
For my own, I had to do some thinking about this one, and especially because at Clara they're going to be doing the ZFS horror stories. I wanted to try to avoid any ZFS-related horror stories, and that still leaves a lot of things to pick from, but I think I've got the one. When I first came to Columbia, South Carolina in 2001, I had been here for a couple of years. I guess it would have been about 2003, maybe 2004. The job that I came to Columbia for had evaporated out from beneath me, which began my full-time career as a mercenary sysadmin, whether I liked it or not. And for a while there, I was working with another guy who had an established small IT firm in town. And he would contract me for some of his thornier jobs because he mostly was sending relatively unsupervised junior people out to things. And he didn't really have the cavalry to call in. So I was the cavalry. And one of the jobs that guy sent me on with a crew of junior folks. All right. So it's been more than 20 years, but I still want to be real careful. I don't want to name any names here. They sent us to a business that it turned out had its own full T1, which was a big deal in 2003, 2004. And every single machine in the building had access to that full T1 worth of bandwidth. And you know what? They were all on one single flat public subnet with no firewall whatsoever. So you have an entire building full of machines, everything from the servers to everybody's individual workstations to God help you if you walked in with a laptop, all have wide open public IP addresses. And the company had been complaining that their internet speed was just way slower than it should have been. And when I got in there, it wasn't just their internet speed that was way slower than it should have been. Everything was vastly slower than it should have been because the absolute last entity in terms of priority for any of their processing cycles or network bandwidth or storage bandwidth was themselves. The entire internet was using the whole company as its own playground. You look at a server, you're going to find 10 different script kiddies on there, all warring over whose jobs are doing what. You go log into somebody's workstation, it's the same thing. The same thing. You've still got like 5 to 10 different script kiddies all trying to do their own thing. Some of them are trying to steal data. Most of them are trying to upload porn. Some of them are trying to upload, wares, cracked games or whatever. It was an absolute nightmare. And believe it or not, that company resisted very strongly when, I said in no uncertain terms, we have to put you behind a firewall before we can do anything else. They didn't like that idea.
Yeah, I remember those days where there was a way to basically hide the files you were uploading in the swap file, which, as people know, by default is invisible when you're browsing the file system. And so you could fill the hard drive on that Windows 2000 server with all your wares or whatever, and they wouldn't show up in the file system as somebody was browsing around because they were all hidden in the swap file.
There was almost certainly some of that going on from, one or two of the smarter kiddies, but boy, howdy, you didn't even bother looking for that because every hard drive was just, full of where's.exe and what have you.
When I did my work placement during high school at the power plant, they had a similar thing. They had a /16 of IP addresses because they'd been around that long. And just every machine in the entire company had its own dedicated publicly routable IP address. Now, they did have firewalls, and most of those subnets weren't reachable from the internet, but they're using gobs of valuable IP space for every Windows machine that could have been on some internal subnet instead. And it was just, especially at the time when I was doing, IRC hosting and so on, and knew how valuable individual IP addresses were. I'm like, there's so many IP addresses and they're not using them for anything useful.
Also, if you folks aren't sufficiently horrified by my story, given the lack of detail and what have you, I'm basically just saying, it's just, tons and tons of malware and script kiddies everywhere, wherever you look. Maybe add this little detail to it. I said this was 2003 or 2004, right? Windows Firewall didn't debut until Windows Server 2003. When I say there was no firewall in the place, there was no hardware firewall in front of the whole network. There was no hardware firewall in front of the server rack. There were no software firewalls on the individual servers or the individual machines. It was wide open in a way that nothing is wide open in 2024. And half of the internet knew it was there and it was their playground.
You mean they'd never heard of Zone Alarm?
Ew.
Well, it is horror stories. We're trying to make people's skin crawl.
That's fair. That's fair. I didn't realize we were going for body horror. I thought it was more of an IT horror kind of a thing.
Yeah, another one for me that was not really horrific, but a bit spooky was we had extra space in the rack we had rented at that cable ISP. And so we deployed some old machines and were offering to rent them out. And we found this company that was interested, and they put, their copy of Windows Server on this thing. So I got it all set up in my house, and we took it to the data center and we racked it and plugged it in and booted up and everything was fine. And then we realized it wouldn't let us RDP into it and couldn't figure out why. And then it dawned on us the Windows Firewall was on by default and didn't allow RDP through. But we've already racked this thing up, and this was a small data center. It didn't really have crash carts where you could easily wheel up a monitor and keyboard and plug it in and fix the server. And it's we'd have to unrack it and find a monitor and try to do all this stuff, or take it back to my house and come back another day. And we don't want to do that. So I used my phone, which at the time was an HTC Touch running Windows CE, and managed to look up the netsh command to disable the Windows Firewall from the command line. So I'm standing at the back of a rack of servers with a little USB keyboard that I've plugged into the server. And I just press Control-Delete and wait a second, type the username, press Tab, type the password, press Enter, listen to the hard drive start chugging, and just wait about 2 minutes to make sure it's logged all the way in. And then Windows key R, command, and get a command prompt, wait those, and then run the netsh command, which isn't something you just put on the command line. It's an interactive thing. So you run netsh and it starts netsh, and then you put commands in. And so then I put in the 2 or 3 commands from this website, doing each one twice in a row in case I made a typo I didn't see. And then calling a friend and having them trying to RDP into this IP address and see if it worked yet or not, if they could connect and get to the login screen. I was having to hold the keyboard with one hand and type with one hand standing in the hot aisle of a data center trying to do this completely blind and like visualizing what Windows is doing. And, this was a long time ago and I had a bit more Windows experience then, but even then I was really a command line Unix person, not so much a Windows person. So it was quite a stretch to do this whole setup blind.
I used to have to do that kind of thing all the time in the 1990s. Usually it wasn't anything like super impressive, like standing in a data center or whatever. It'd be a small business server if you were lucky, or maybe even just somebody's computer and like the monitor died and you wanted to shut it down safely or whatever. And you're sitting there like entering commands blindly. And yeah, I remember what you're talking about, like listening for the hard drive activity and being like, that doesn't sound like the right amount of hard drive activity for what I thought I just did. Where do we go from here? So you're just kind of like using the force until what you want to happen actually happens. But I haven't had to do that in a long time. That was very much a 90s phenomenon for me. Since we're doing spooky, not necessarily horror, though, I think the spookiest story I've got, it's not scary, just a little funny to me anyway. I actually once successfully unplugged a rack mount server from a UPS and plugged it into a different UPS without losing the server. It stayed online from me jerking the power plug from the first UPS, which was the battery in it had failed, so it needed to be replaced. This was not a dual PSU machine. There was no redundant anything. I had just bought the new UPS and, got it all plugged up, and the only thing left was to migrate the server over. And I wish I could say that, this was some badass thing. We couldn't possibly shut down the server. We totally could have. I was just in a bad mood at the end of the day. And, this was a ZFS box, and crashing the power was not going to hurt anything. There was no load on the machine. So just for grins, I yanked the plug out and plugged it into the second one. And to my great shock, when I looked up, I saw the prompt still on the screen. And I was like, whoa! And I started typing. And sure enough, the computer just did not care that for a few milliseconds, it was utterly without power.
Wow. Huh. But yeah, not really spooky, but one that gave me an anxiety attack at the time, going all the way back to when I was in high school. My homework was due, and I had finished writing my long essay and saved it on my computer. And then the image on my screen kind of just shot out at me and the monitor went dark. The monitor on my computer had just died. So now I couldn't finish my homework or print it, and it was due the next day. So I managed to get a hold of my neighbor and borrow an old monitor. But it turns out this old monitor was older and didn't support the resolution that my computer ran at. It can only do 800 by 600, not the 1024 by 768 that my monitor had run at for Windows 98 or whatever. So when you plugged it in and Windows booted up and ran at its resolution, it was just roiling stuff. You couldn't see anything. It was all just a weird blur of sliding images. And so I knew enough that I booted into safe mode, which dumbed the graphics down to basic VGA 800 by 600, and I could fire up Word and finish typing the essay. But the whole point of safe mode is there are no drivers loaded that might be crashing Windows and causing it not to start. So you couldn't print. So then after I finished writing the whole essay and saving it, I had to boot back into Windows and blind had to manage to get Word to start, open the right file, and hit Control P to have it print. I don't actually remember exactly how I did it, but I did.
Putting it in the context of homework reminded me, I said that, that phenomenon was mostly a 90s thing for me. I'd actually started in the 80s. I think it was the most common for me in the 80s with 8-bit machines. The monitor would die, and it's not like these days. Like, a monitor and a TV are the same thing, and there's a million of them in your house, and, you can probably just go grab one and drag it over, or just, head right down to whatever store and buy another one immediately for not a whole lot of money and bring it there. Like, it was an event if your monitor died back in the 80s. So there were quite a few times, I'm recalling now, that, yeah, that was the issue is, it was way back with like an Apple II series machine, and there would be no monitor. And, thankfully then, it's no GUI. Everything was at a prompt. But yeah, a lot of blind typing and, figuring out like I need to save this data to a floppy, and I can get that floppy out, and I can take the floppy to somebody else's computer where I can't really just go steal somebody else's monitor. Heck, in some cases, the monitor would be built into the computer. And, if the monitor died, you were just stuck.
Yep. Or just like the fact that monitors didn't communicate what resolutions and refresh rates they supported to the computer. Like now, your computer can tell what resolutions your monitor supports, and why when you change the resolution, your computer always prompts you, are you okay with this new resolution? Because back in the day, you might not be able to see that message. And that's why it counts down for 10 seconds and then switches back to where you would actually be able to see what was happening.
Remember when there was a non-zero possibility that changing your resolution would literally fry the actual monitor?
Yeah, especially configuring like X on Linux. And it's like, yeah, you can pick whatever numbers you want, but if you pick the wrong one, the magic smoke might come out.
Well, that wasn't just Linux. It was that way on Windows 95 and Windows 98 as well. If you pick the wrong frame rate and the wrong resolution, and yeah, you could damage some CRTs.
All right, well, I've got a story to finish this that just gets worse and worse and more horrific the more I tell it. Right, so I went on Amazon and I bought a 10 terabyte WD Elements USB drive. And I got it delivered and I opened it up, shucked it, as they say.
Idiocracy is not a horror movie.
Put the little bit of tape over the relevant pin so that it would work, plugged it into my NAS and installed ZFS on it and Samba and everything and used it as my NAS for several months. Then one day, my wife says to me, the NAS was making a kind of funny noise the other day. And I said, really? Okay, well, point out when it next happens. And then a couple of days go by, and then I hear this noise.
A tap, tap, tapping at my chamber door.
Yeah.
Quoth the NAS, nevermore.
Yeah, and I narrowed it down to the NAS, right? And I thought, oh shit, this disk is about to die. I need to replace this. So I bought another disk, a proper one this time, and I put it in. And I just left the other one in. I thought, let's just see how long until it dies. And this was probably like 2 years ago. It's still in there. And every now and again, it just does it. And every night, all my stuff gets backed up to that dodgy shuck disk. And it's still working.
I will repeat, Idiocracy is not a horror movie.
Damn it. Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. Let's do some free consulting then. If you want to send in your questions for Jim and Allan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Kyle writes, I'd like to purchase a few UPSs for my homelab and workstations. Are true sine wave ones worth it, or are regular ones okay? Any brands I should avoid? I'm looking at about 1500 volt amps for capacity.
Okay, so first up, you absolutely do not need, nor will you benefit from, true sine wave UPSs in a home lab environment. Those things are extremely expensive, and they're frankly not worth it for most any digital gear. Really, when you want the true sine wave stuff is when you've got like any analog meters or like, audio stuff in the mix, then you want the power to be absolutely as clean as humanly possible. But if you're working with digital stuff, I mean, everything's going through D to A ladders anyway. And if you've got a problem in the source power that's ugly enough to make it through the power conditioning in your digital device's power supply, you're screwed anyway. So given the massive expense, no, don't do that. For the rest of it, brands to avoid or whatever, I won't really say brands to avoid. I will say my favorite brand, especially for a home lab environment, is CyberPower. And the reason for that is CyberPower are the only brand of UPS I've ever encountered where you can not only disable the nasty perma beeping alarm when your power goes out, but it actually stores it in non-volatile storage on the UPS so that it remembers that setting after the power has been out so long that the UPS goes flat. This is important because it's usually not that easy to get at that setting. You usually have to connect a real computer via USB cable, install some dodgy software, telnet in if you're very lucky, which you're usually not, and then you can go through some horrid text menu-based thing to ultimately, mute your device and hopefully have it remember for a while. If you do that with any other brand, If you let that UPS go all the way flat, it will have forgotten it, and the next time your power goes out, but the cyber powers, my house is packed chock full of them, and ever since I discovered that cyber power was the brand that would stay permamuted, it has been an enormous boon for me because I no longer dread the power outage when I have to listen to all that crap beeping all over the house at 2 a.m.
I mostly have the APC, American Power Converter one, because of what Costco had on sale. Luckily, they're not as bad about the beeping as Jim said. There's a button with a speaker with a slash through it, and if you press it, it'll stop. And if you hold it for 3 or 4 seconds, it'll make a beep and remember not to do it.
Only until the battery goes all the way flat.
Yes, if it goes all the way dead, it might forget that, and that can be a bit annoying. But yeah, not that picky about it. I will say definitely worth having, considering the number of people I've seen who've like blown a power supply in their computer versus it never happens to my computers because they're behind a UPS. It really does seem to make a big difference in the lifetime of everything in the computer and just the general quality of it function. I've also heard it click in and decide to run off battery for a couple seconds when the lights have flickered or the dimmed or something else happened in the neighborhood that modified stuff. And as a stats geek, it's also nice to just be able to see exactly how many volts are actually coming out of the wall. Because, we talk about it being like 110 or 120 or whatever, but even at my house, I've seen it literally range from 112 to 126.
I've seen 105 to darn near 130 in any number of places in my neck of North America.
Yeah, and in the UK, it's nominally 230, but it's really 240. But I've seen like up to nearly 250 and down in the 220s. So it does vary a lot. Kyle says he's looking at around 1500 volt amps. Presumably you need a bit of headroom there. That's
a decent amount of headroom for a couple of PCs on each one. When I had my rack, I was running the whole thing off 2 or 3 of those. But, you can't get much more than that on a regular 15 amp outlet in North America anyway.
That is absolutely correct.
There's a reason why that's about the biggest size you get in the kind of home office shaped ones. Like mine's an APC Backups 1500G. And that is about the biggest you're going to get in that style because it's about as much as you can put through one normal 15 amp circuit.
Given that Alan's already given you the number for how many amps can run through the circuit, quick math, what's 100 times 15? It's 1500. So you're not getting much more power than that out of a standard, not only a standard outlet like a single plug, like the whole thing. And not only that double gang probably outlet in your wall, but the entire circuit that it's on, which in most American homes is probably going to be anywhere from, 5 to 6 separate outlets. So 1500 volt amp is pretty beefy for home lab use. Now, the other thing that I'll mention about this is that I would strongly recommend get your Wi-Fi on that UPS as well. I see most people put their computer on the UPS and they just ignore their poor router and, any Wi-Fi access points they might have. And as a result, the computer might stay up when the power goes out, but they lose internet access. Now, if you put your Wi-Fi router and or access points also behind the UPS, most frequently when your power goes out, the ISP is still up, which means that if you've got that stuff on a UPS, your phones, your tablets, your what have you, you've still got internet. And that can make an enormous difference in how much human level misery you as the admin of your house have to deal with when your spouse, kids, roommates, whoever are walking around whining about how they can't get to Facebook.
Yeah, and if you have a 1500 volt amp UPS, and even if you have just one computer and monitor on it, you're only looking at 15, 20 so minutes of power on time. If the blackout's longer than that, you're really going to want your phone to still have the internet.
On the other hand, if you put, a serious UPS, I'm more frequently am using 1200 volt amp than 15, but it really doesn't matter that much because honestly, when you take them apart, typically the 1200 and the 1500 and even frequently the 900 volt amp UPSs, they all got the same battery inside. The difference is not in how many amp hours you've got on the battery to run things for how long. It's literally just in the maximum amount of power it can supply in any given second. But the point being, if you get a big honking UPS and not the little teeny tiniest one that you can find, and you put that behind nothing but your network gear, a router, maybe a switch, maybe some Wi-Fi access points, you'll discover that may stay up for an hour and a half, 2 hours during a power outage, which again can improve your quality of life tremendously.
Yep. Again, I have a 1200 volt amp one that I got at Costco. sitting in my laundry room, and all it does is power the Wi-Fi, the switches, the modems, and all that kind of stuff to keep the network and the Wi-Fi and the internet working during the power outage. And yeah, it's the one that'll last hours because, the switch and the modem pull like 5 watts versus the computer that's pulling hundreds of watts.
And the last thing that I'll mention on this, because it's not that obvious to a lot of folks, if you've got separate Wi-Fi access points, like Ubiquiti's or the TP-Links that we recommend here a lot, whatever, put those behind a PoE switch, because that means you can run 5, 10, 20, whatever of these access points off of the power to that single switch, off of a single UPS, rather than have to run around your entire house and, set up like 5 different UPSs, each with one access point plugged into it. That sucks. That's too much money to spend, but you don't have to do that.
If your NAS is in the same place as the network gear, is it okay to stick it on one UPS, or would you always recommend having a separate one for the network gear?
It just depends on how much runtime you want. Your NAS is typically going to pull considerably more power than your network-only gear will. It's just the nature of storage and also the nature of typically, hotter compute in most NAS devices. But again, if you're okay with that, if you're like, well, I only need about half an hour of runtime, well, see what you can get. And you can usually estimate that pretty well. Yank the plug out of the wall for your UPS while all the stuff you got plugged into it is turned on. Your UPS will give you, typically, if it's a new UPS, the older ones get a bit more ropey with the estimates, but it'll give you an estimated runtime. And you can say, well, I do like this amount of runtime, or I don't like this amount of runtime. If you don't like it, add more UPS.
And should you be running that battery down periodically and charging it back up again, or is it better to just leave it charged up all the time?
Just let it be. If the firmware wants to do weird stuff with discharge cycles, the firmware can and will do that for itself. But it's just not usually a very big concern.
Especially considering the life cycle of the battery. Like, those batteries only last a couple of years. And so that would be the one other thing I would suggest, especially if you're looking at anything that's not like an APC or CyberPower, like Jim was mentioning, is look at how difficult it's going to be to get replacement batteries a couple of years from now. Depending on the device, sometimes it's almost cheaper to just find a new UPS on sale than it is to get a replacement battery. But, I've had good luck getting APC replacement batteries from third-party vendors and so on.
Same with CyberPower. In fact, I think they take the same batteries.
Almost entirely likely, yes. They are just a pretty plain old lead-acid battery. It's just, it has to have the right form factor and the right connector in order to actually work.
The other fun fact about that, what you'll discover the first time you change one of these batteries, if you've got a larger UPS, the 1200, 1500, whatever, it's usually actually not a single battery. It's usually 2 batteries, and they're taped together on the inside, which is not that immediately obvious when you take it apart. But if you're just looking for a thing that looks like the thing you got, then you wind up stymied. You're like, I can't find this battery anywhere. So look a little closer, make sure it's not 2 different batteries literally taped together, because that's usually what it is, in which case you're actually looking for 2 replacement batteries, and you can decide whether to tape your 2 together or just put them in there and connect the electrical bits and have done with it.
Yeah, on the APCs, the 2 batteries are stuck together with a sticker on each side, one red, one green, to make sure you put it in the right way around, because they ship it with the battery the wrong way around so it can't power on. That sticker also has the tab that's how you can pull the battery out of the UPS easily.
And it's probably best not to just throw it in the bin when you change it for the new one, eh?
Yes. Please do use the instructions in the manual and recycle it the same as you would like a car battery or whatever, because it is full of nasty lead acid and so on.
Yeah, it is a lead acid battery, same chemistry as a car battery, incredibly environmentally toxic if you don't dispose of it properly.
I also have a very large UPS for my rack. So it's got a 30 amp, 240 volt twist lock connector and is 6,000 volt amps. So it's, I think, 3U in the rack, and there's a second 3U second battery that bolts into it to give it a bit more runtime. But with a rack full of servers, the runtime is not all that high. But I guess circling back to Joe's question about running your NAS on the same UPS as your Wi-Fi and so on, the one thing you can do there, if your UPS supports the USB connection or whatever, is use something like UPSD to have the NAS be like, okay, the power's been out for more than 60 seconds. I'm going to shut down so that the rest of the battery can be left for the networking gear.
The final thing that I'll mention is if you're not Allan, don't be Allan. Don't put a gigantic, incredibly expensive rack mount UPS you had to special order and took a week or two to arrive in your rack, in your home lab, because what you're going to find is one day it won't power on and you're going to have to plug all your crap straight into the wall because you can't just run down to the store and grab another one to put it in. I can't tell you how many times I have ripped out rack-mounted UPSs in small business environments even because, well, I had to anyway to get them running that day because they had this special rack-mounted UPS they paid an arm and a leg for and took forever to get in, and it would have been a week or two to replace it, whereas I could just drive straight down to the Office Depot, buy 3 or 4 of those 1500 volt amp UPSs for way less money than they spent on the one rack mount, drop those sitting on a shelf side by side in the rack, plug all the gear into it, and it's the same capacity or more for a lot less money, and you can literally just drive down to the store and buy another one whenever any one of them conks out.
We did that for a long time, but then the amount of gear in the rack got to the point where there weren't enough 15 amp circuits within reach, so doing a 240 volt 30 amp circuit into the room made more sense. And because it's such a stupendously overpriced UPS, it has a bypass mode so that even if it goes completely dead, it has a physical switch that makes the power just go around the broken UPS.
How much you spend on that UPS, Allan?
A lot. And I'm not looking forward to the day when the batteries need to be replaced. And that day is coming relatively soon. The device has already started sending me alerts. It's like, well, these batteries are 4 years old now, you realize, right?
You hear how he doesn't want to cough up an actual number? Don't be Allan, folks.
Yeah.
To be fair, I'm really not being negative toward Allan here. Allan makes a lot of money off the gear in his house, which makes it a lot more feasible to talk about this kind of thing. It's not the same kind of, well, it's just a home lab where like I learn and I tinker with stuff that most of our listeners are going to have. If you're making a ton of money off of the stuff in your home and that makes more sense for you, then it makes more sense and do it. I want to make sure that people don't make the mistake of biting off more than they can chew with this stuff.
Yeah, I think especially to Jim's point is you might get offered one of these rack mount UPSs that somebody's getting rid of. Don't fall for that. It's a money pit. Just get the desktop ones from Costco. You will be much happier.
I would also like to point out that occasionally UPSs catch on fire. I have had that happen to me 3 times over the course of my career. 2 of those times, it was with the desktop style UPS, which it's really easy to just unplug it out of the wall and run outside and like dump it on the ground. However, when it's a 260-pound team lift rack mount UPS, it's a whole lot scarier dragging that thing out and getting it out of the freaking building where it won't burn you down, especially if you happen to be in that office alone on a weekend, having just mounted the thing in the rack all by yourself despite all the team lift everywhere. So, personal war story, don't be a Jim either.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Allan Jude.
We'll see you next week.